team. My name is Jake. I'm from the Philippines. I will be your solo judge. So with the motion that this House would, as Pope Francis, would expose the gay network in the Vatican. On affirmative, we have UPD 1. On opposition, we have ADMU 1. A few reminders before we start the round. First, please maximize the use of your time, but avoid overtime. We have the preference not to credit anything from your speech if it goes beyond 7:20. Secondly, please take and receive points of information and points of clarification. They're very important to make this debate more engaging. So without further ado, I would now like to call on the Prime Minister to start this debate. Here.
After decades of inability of reform since Vatican II, we believe that the election of Pope Francis, we have come to an age of dawn of the reform of the church. But we believe that the popularity of him and we believe that we have the opportunity to change the time and serve, and we believe that this time serves as an opportunity for us to change the church for the better with the reforms that will coming from the policy of government. Because the main principle coming from government is preaching on the idea of consistencies. That if you preach the idea of acceptance, that you need to practice that kind of acceptance, and you need to believe that acceptance can also come from your organization and not just expect it from people and not practice it on your own. So basically, the stance coming from government is going to be simple. That Pope Francis has the responsibility to expose the gay network within the Vatican, meaning the priests, the cardinals, the bishops, or what have you. So what are the prongs coming from our side? We believe that as a church, they have the responsibility to continue to preach acceptance and therefore act on it by therefore releasing a verified list of homosexuals in the organization or what have you. So what's the burden coming from us and what are we going to do as government? Number one, that we need to prove that with this policy, we can win back the trust of the people. Number two, that we can properly tackle the issue of homosexuality and the church stands on it with our policy. Number three, that you can actually give better and the proper treatment of homosexuals, not only with the church, but also in society with our policy. And number four, why this in itself is not only good for the homosexuals in the organization, the church, but also for homosexuals outside. And number five, that we will concede that there might be short-term consequences, but in long-term, we're actually bettering off the church and homosexuals at the end of the day. So what's my first argument? Why it is actually in line with the principles of the church and is part of the responsibility of the Pope. First point of clarification on this argumentation is that we believe there's no conflict between homosexuality itself and what the Catholic Church actually preaches. Because what it actually is against is the act of sodomy itself and not necessarily you being a homosexual. So therefore, we believe that it is inconsistent for you as a church to not necessarily accept and own out that homosexuals are part of your organization just because you had this old medieval thinking that we need to reform at the end of the day. So actually, we even think that beyond the idea that this is consistent with the principles of the church, the Pope also enjoys infallibility. And we believe that he can actually back on this to further strengthen the rhetoric of the acceptance of homosexuality and therefore strengthening the consistency of the church and actually correcting the inconsistency that has been playing out for centuries or what have you later. First idea is on the mandate of the Pope. It's not necessarily just preaching, what has been happening for centuries, but it's also the responsibility of the church to adapt the interpretation of doctrines or beliefs to what is happening today. Because I will tell you that it has happened in the past. You have various councils, the Council of Trent or what have you, and even most recently, the Vatican II. So meaning there is a trend of the church actually adapting to what's really happening in status quo. Because if you look at it, centuries ago, you could not even hear Mass in English or in your local languages, and now you can do it. Before it was just Latin. So therefore, there is a precedence for you to actually adapt to what's happening in society. And now society is more open to homosexuals. Society wants the church to accept homosexuals at that. So the conclusion is that reforms have happened in the past. And actually, we believe that it is actually even good for homosexuals within the church. Why? Because there are a lot of priests, bishops, or even cardinals, it's an open secret, that are gay, and that they are not able to actually openly admit that they are gay because they're afraid. They don't have the power, they don't have the capital to actually open up to what they are really, or admit it to the public. And that's basically what the Pope can do. He can liberate them from the agony of being unable to express themselves and being unable to actually own up to who they really are. So second argument is that the propensity to have more trust on the public coming from us. Because if you look at it, how would a more moderate and liberal constituency trust an organization that is still archaic and conservative at the end of the day? That what you're getting from us is that you have an image of the church reforming and an image of the church showing that they are more accepting of these kinds of oppressed factions in society anyway. But before I move on, yes?
You're being value neutral so far. Why is it necessary to expose? Why can't the Pope, for instance, just declare that they will accept homosexual priests and cardinals?
Because at the end of the day, you need to show that you are owning up to what you're really doing. Because what you're gonna get from opposition with that model is mere lip service. You need to have tangible actions coming from the organization itself for people to believe you and for people to continue thinking that you are credible, and for people to continue believing that you are consistent with what you're preaching anyway. So what you're getting from us is you're actually even winning back the trust of the people. That the people now support the homosexuals at the end of the day, and that's a trend that you necessarily need to understand as part of government side. Because at the end of the day, that what you show, it's not even just for the moderates or the liberals. For in the short term, we can see that you might harm the conservatives or what have you. But most likely the effect is that you show the conservatives that you can even actually accept these people, because you can now actually try to have a compromise or try to resolve the conflict between your faith and your sexuality at the end of the day. That you can still believe in God, be a devout priest, even if you are a homosexual at that. Because that's the basic tension that people have a hard time resolving right now. And if the church has the ability to resolve it for the other people, be an example, then that's a thing we're willing to make. And that's a thing that we want to happen coming from government side. That you send the message that, it's time to accept, and that these people, at the end of the day, have a hard time accepting themselves. That's why the Pope needs to do it for them, that he has larger capital and larger capacity to actually send a message. Because he could not necessarily just assume that just because the Pope says this, then the people will follow. Tangible action must follow the lip service that's going to happen on opposition side, and you need to understand that no ordinary individual has greater rhetoric than the Pope at the end of the day. Because if he is the infallible one, then most likely more people would actually listen to him compared to any other kind of actor in this kind of situation. That's why coming from us, we've proven to you why it's actually better for the homosexuals, better for the Catholic Church if you follow government model, and that's why we're very, very proud to propose. Thanks.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we agree that the Church should be reaching out to homosexuals in society more. What we don't agree is that this is any way an effective way of achieving that goal. Our clash is very simple, that Pope Francis should not expose the gay networks in the Vatican. He should ask them to come out. If there are actual confirmed gay priests that he is sure exists He should talk to them really nicely, reassure them that the church will not condemn them, and ask them to speak about their experiences. Because the problem with government side is that they haven't shown why this is a necessary step given the agenda that all of us in this room agree with anyway. I'm going to be forwarding our case on two levels. First of all, on why forced outing is wrong in principle, and second of all, how it's going to regress the church's agenda in terms of what its goals are, which again is a thing that they agree with. But before that, there's a lot more to discuss. The first thing to clarify is what we really get from their policy, because they've conflated a lot of benefits and a lot of different policies together, and it's largely a product of the imprecise language that I decided to speak with. He says, do all of these nice things and we'll get all of these nice benefits. But what he wasn't able to show was that the necessary step towards that was forcibly outing all of these gay members of the Vatican. He says, start preaching acceptance. He says, tell priests that it's okay to be gay. He says, tell regular people that it's okay to be gay. Tell the lay people that it's okay to be gay. And send that encyclical down to the masses, and eventually they will start changing their minds. They haven't shown us why this is insufficient. And if they're going to talk about burdens like they will a lot in this debate, it is their burden to show us why those things are insufficient. What did he say in this regard? He said it was mere lip service. That is all the church does. It preaches things and then people listen. Like saying, hey, we should accept gays, telling that, teaching it to school children in all of these Catholic schools will literally make them accept gays more, right? So that is their burden, showing why forced outing is necessary and showing why it's in the interest of Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, right? So moving on to my first argument, we think forced outing is wrong in principle, right? The principle I'm talking about is the principle where you respect the autonomy and the right of an individual to control their own identity. They went here probably because they have like prepared rebuttals or whatever, right? But that's something they're completely out of line with because they're completely taking control away from the people whose identities we're working with right now, right? This is an internationally accepted norm all around the world that people's privacy includes their identity and what they do and do not show about that. Why do we think this actually matters? Why is this more than just a principle? Because it is the gay priest that ultimately bears the consequences of people knowing. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Priests live in very conservative religious networks. And an important thing to remember about these networks is they lag behind how progressive the already very slowly progressive church is. You have a problem with that, Leomar?
But won't those people tackle the same consequences under your side as well when you're asking them to out themselves?
No, see, this is how you have to realize they're not in all literally the exact same situation. Some are better placed to come out than others. We don't think it's unreasonable to think that some of them will come out and achieve, therefore, literally all of your goals. So listen to the argument, right? Think about it again. Priests live in conservative networks, religious networks, their family. If you are a priest, you probably come from a very religious family, and most of the friends and co-workers and all of those people you have in your network that you work with, that you rely on for your social well-being, and humans are social beings, right, are people who are probably quite conservative, and maybe some of the other ones are gay, right? So here's the thing. Even if their minds eventually change, it takes time. And what happens is, before that actually happens, your life is ruined, even if it's not done so in any official capacity. Why do we think this is likely? Look at Vatican II. Vatican II came out in the 1970s, and it was one of the most liberal, progressive things the church has ever done, changing the language, the vernacular, all of these things. And up until today, there are still lots of groups within the church who are unhappy with the direction that it took. As recently as Pope Benedict's time, which is still a lot of the people in the Vatican, like they're still aligned with him, they're thinking that we should go back to a Latin Mass, that we should go back to having the priest face the altar, and all of these other old-fashioned things, and they are resisting change. So what the policy does inevitably, at least for some amount of time, is that it ruins the lives of these priests, who will likely die soon. They're priests, they're old, in pursuit of some higher goal, which is achieved anyway, unless they're able to show that that's not going to happen. Lastly, why do we think this regresses the church's agenda? We're going to agree with their goals for the framework of this argument. The church wants to reach out to a world which is slowly liberalizing. It wants to build bridges. It wants to bring back followers and show them that the church is something that can exist today without compromising its core values. First of all, let's characterize the liberal people that they're aiming for in the first place. One of the core tenets of liberal ideology all around the world is respect for the autonomy of an individual person. This is why we care about gay rights, because we think that even if you don't fit into the neat little categorizations of who you should be in society, if you want to be a certain way, you should have the right to practice that identity. Before I move on, Leomar had a point. Okay, never mind. That's the important thing, right? And part of that autonomy over your identity isn't just to do what you want, but to be able to control what people perceive of you as well, to the extent that no one else is getting hurt. To that extent, we have heard absolutely no analysis coming from the government side so far. But here's the other problem, right? If the church has an interest in making sure that it's keeping its followers so that it can do all of the things that a church wants to do, as in preach its message, make sure that it's doing social good, it's going to be massively pissing off conservatives in this regard, right? Because it's going to be making such a big deal over how, look at all of these gays, and we're going to have them, and we're forcibly outing them, and this is the right way to do things. So if you're convincing them, you're giving them a very bad idea. But what's more likely as well is that you're antagonizing the people on this end of the spectrum as well in a very upfront way. This is a suboptimal, less than ideal way of preaching to these people that gays are fine, right? Because it's going to confirm suspicions that, hey, there have been gays in the Vatican all along, and this is why this policy is happening at all. So what their policy does in the end is, on the liberal end of the spectrum and on the conservative end of the spectrum, they're losing out on followers, and they're making it so that the church has less of a capacity to do the things that it ought to do. And it's doing this at the cost of something which is principally wrong all around the world, and they gain literally nothing. We are very glad to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition, and I'll call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Over the course of the speech, I'm going to answer 6 questions and have 6 discussions and prove to you why the previous speaker was not only largely unresponsive to Prime Minister, but given their current stance so far, they definitely have to lose this debate. Firstly, how important is personal autonomy if you're a member of the clergy? Considering we're not just talking about random people here who we're exposing, we're talking about people who've already been in the clergy who have made a conscious choice. The premise I've already revealed. The decision to enter the priesthood is made by that person and that person alone, right? And in fact, we think you can always opt out of being a priest, meaning the choice to be in the clergy is a conscious one that a person has to be able to renew. What do we think does this entail? It entails a significant loss of personal liberty. In fact, they take vows of chastity, they take vows of poverty. Now let's ask the intuitive question. Why must this kind of loss of personal liberty extend to losing your control over absolutely controlling your identity or absolutely controlling your privacy, exactly as Nick argued a while ago? We think, simply put, and this is the answer I already gave you, which they never responded to, you're handling the faith and the spiritual welfare of hundreds of people. We think it's largely wrong for the Vatican to continue to condone people who are preaching that homosexuality is bad and that people who do homosexual acts will go to hell, all the while knowing that these people are the same homosexual itself. We think there is a responsibility to be consistent, and there is a responsibility to tackle properly that issue out there. And as long as these people can hide behind the veil that they are not homosexuals, then we can never properly tackle that issue, then it will forever remain in the back burner. All the while people are being deceived, all the while people are being lied to. But we think, secondly, it's not just even about knowing, or it's not just about even the principle level. We think when people see these gay priests, or when people start asking questions about these gay priests, when what they see about these gay priests is inconsistent with what these gay priests start preaching, then we think that's when people start losing faith over the church, right? So we think ultimately what's important for you to consider is this clergyman might have personal autonomy, yes, but we think we largely gave up a lot of that, and we think this logically extends to losing control over their privacy as far as sexual issues are concerned. But the second thing I want to be able to respond, and second thing I want to be able to tackle, is exactly their counter proposal about exposing the gay network on their own volition, right? And we have several problems with that. One, we think they're already agreeing that there's a value in you knowing about how many people, or are we agreeing in the value in knowing about how many gay people are in the Vatican? But this is where the nitty-gritty starts being different. Under their side, you'll only know about the few people who have the balls. The only you'll know about the few people who have the guts to be able to come out at the end of the day. Why do we think is that particularly problematic? Number one, we think our value lies in you being able to see the wider picture of homosexuality, meaning you see sheer numbers. You see the fact that there are lots of gay people, even in the most conservative societies, who are gay, who are still gay, who are still quite proficient, who are still quite dedicated and devoted to their faith, right? Under their side, only the people who think they can handle the consequences will come out. But these are people who are already in liberal contexts, and in these liberal contexts, we think this is largely a tokenistic move, because in these liberal contexts, anyway, those people will be fine with homosexuals. Anyway, these people will stop or not oppress homosexuals. We think the value is most important in particular conservative societies, because the priests themselves are afraid, and the priests themselves are still at conflict with their own identity. So on the first level, we think the problem with their side is they were agreeing to the value, but the value is only constricted to those people who are liberal enough, when we think that's essentially wrong. But second, we can't trust the individual to understand the consequences simply because they do not understand the wider picture. One conservative priest will be scared of coming out on his own volition because he is going to say, people are going to stone me. But the moment the Vatican does it to all the priests all alone, we don't think that you can expect all the conservative people to start stoning all the priests that essentially exist. We think the sheer value of numbers that can't exist when you rely on consent, when you rely on the goodwill of these individual priests, is something that you can only have under our side. And if they agree that you should properly tackle homosexuality, we think it's ultimately wrong and ultimately disgusting that homosexuality is only a privilege that you can have if you're in a liberal society in the first place. Thirdly, let's talk about his case of pissing off conservatives, which we think is largely already been conceded to by Prime Minister. One, we think it's largely a short-term reaction, right? He had to be able to respond to why suddenly people being pissed off will last generations, especially since conservatives are also have the capability to be able to adapt their stances or to die if that's what's necessary. But more importantly, we don't think why essentially this is value. Why should Pope Francis start thinking about what conservatives do and not thinking about what is right for his particular church? Conservatives are mad that he came out against free market capitalism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should start following the conservatives. This is a church that needs to start thinking about what's right and not think essentially about what conservatives are going to think. Before I move on, go.
Alright, so you talked about priests in conservative societies. Everything we're talking about is in the Vatican, but even if it's a community-to-community basis, unless you're expecting a gay priest in every church, people will just be hearing about priests from other churches anyway, and there's no loss in that.
Okay, number one, that's already agreeing to our value, but there's still quite a gap, because under their side, there's still a probability that it won't happen. That's first. But second, you have to consider that even certain people in the Vatican, like the diocese, I don't want to get into the technicalities, still have home countries, so it's not as if we're just talking about centralized value here, right? So the last thing I want to talk about is the misunderstanding of homosexuality that exists right now, and especially homosexuality in the church, and how it has largely affected the perceptions of people and the policies of people. The problem with status quo is that you have one current monolithic image of what homosexuality is, and that is exposed by pedophile priests. And the only gay priests that you ever hear of are pedophiles, because they're the only ones that get caught, simply because they're the only ones that you hear about in the media. Why is that essentially wrong? We think because in this particular model, the only images that Catholics see of homosexuals are deviants. Those people who would go as far as to rape children, those people who would go so as far to exploit the most vulnerable in society. Number one, this leads to you to not be able to tackle the fundamental issue of homosexuality, because you already have a gap. In a sense, you can't appreciate it as a real thing that a normal person would choose, because the only images that you see of it are deviants doing it behind the back with altar boys, right? But secondly, we think the problem with this is the church is fundamentally treating all the homosexuals or bunching in all of the homosexuals in the church as pedophiles as well. We think it's important for you to be able to differentiate those two concepts, and it's important for you to be able to save face with those two particular concepts. This reminds me, what did Nick forget to respond to, which you have to particularly remember? Number one, you have to be able to respond to properly tackling and understanding the issues of homosexuality that can only be gotten if you have the sheer numbers, if you have the sheer understanding of how homosexuality operates in the church. But second, you have to be able to also talk about treatment of homosexuals, and that can be had when authority speaks on their behalf, authority speaks to support them. For all those reasons, we definitely take this debate.
Thanks, Deputy Prime. I now call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to discuss why exposing homosexuals in the Vatican will set back the trend of reform that these guys in AF are celebrating. Some rebuttal will be integrated, but let's deal with stuff that don't quite fit in. First, let's engage with what exactly was the link between the policy and the motion. Because this was something that Nick already put into question, and there was no response whatsoever, or very limited response coming from Leomar. Nick asked you the question, why is it therefore necessary to expose all of these homosexuals? What they said is that, it's just lip service, we need something tangible. Nick correctly pointed out that lip service is already enough, because that's like 80% of what the church already does. But secondly, in addition to that, we would like to ask the question, why should that tangible thing come in the form of forcibly outing and exposing people who want to stay in the closet? There are other ways, for instance, to do something tangible without taking away somebody's autonomy. For instance, Francis can celebrate Christmas or Easter Mass with 3 openly gay priests. He can make an openly gay priest into an archbishop. He can canonize an openly gay religious man. All of these are actually tangible things that show that Pope Francis can be progressive without taking away autonomy from these individuals. But what did they say in relation to autonomy? Leomar was a bit glib in this debate in saying that, there's a vow of celibacy, therefore there should be a vow that all your other rights and privacy should be taken away. That's not how it works. Because firstly, we think that this autonomy argument and autonomy rebuttal was a misrepresentation of what Nick was saying. Because we will concede that the Pope has the power to out priests, but Nick's argument was primarily about whether he ought to be outing priests with this power. This debate is fundamentally an assessment of how Pope Francis should use his power. So we don't care if the law of celibacy exists, because that is not a true rebuttal in this debate. But secondly, he's suddenly saying that it's important to out these people because you cannot preach that homosexuality is wrong while being homosexual because, oh no, that's inconsistent. Well, number one, stop preaching that homosexuality is wrong. So when you start preaching that, hey guys, we accept homosexuality, we will love you, then there's nothing inconsistent about you wanting to be in the closet while still preaching that you accept homosexuality and you accept yourself. So that deals with the consistency problem coming from the previous speaker. But moreover, they suddenly rebut our idea about conservatives that I already allegedly pointed out that there's only a short-term reaction. Why will it last generations? This was insensitive to the dynamics of Nick's argument, because the dynamics of Nick's argument did not only point out that you're alienating the conservatives, but you are doubly alienating the conservatives and the liberals together. So when you alienate these two parts of the spectrum, you are indeed creating something that is a generational change, because you're putting into question the ability of the church to survive and thrive based on the number of faithful that they actually have and the ability of these people to believe in their faith. So while it is an acceptable cause in their world that you're alienating the conservatives, they never argued why it's an acceptable cause to alienate both conservatives and liberals at the very same time. Again, because they didn't engage with Nick's argument that liberals don't want you to be outing homosexuals in the first place. And this is where it gets really, really weird for them. They said that they want to do this because they want to understand the issues of homosexuals. The very first issue of a homosexual is the fact that you're afraid that you will be outed. You're afraid that people will take control of your autonomy. You're afraid that people will shame you when you are not ready to face your family, to face your community. So we think, as far as we are concerned, they're as heteronormative and as imposing as we've seen the patriarchy and other oppressive institutions in the past. So let's talk about why exposing homosexuals in the Vatican will set back the trend of reform. Because if we take a look at much of the argument of Ein, he was correct in pointing out that there's reform here, like we're becoming more and more progressive. But again, the faulty link was he never explained how exactly their policy will push forward that reform and push forward that progressiveness. Why do we anticipate that it will not do so? This is where first I want to deal with Leomar's claim that, oh, you're only going to be showing some people who are gay. I really honestly love numbers very much, but I do not understand why numbers are so important in this debate. Because he really said, oh wow, 1,000 gay priests, without really explaining why 1,000 gay priests will be more meaningful than 10 gay priests or 100 gay priests. And I'm going to explain now why a 10 gay priest or 100 gay priests who want to be out is more valuable than 100 who do not want to be out. This is going to be the analysis. When you forcibly out people who are not ready, it will mean that these people who are not ready will not necessarily be ready to fight for the plight of homosexuals or fight for the acceptance of homosexuals within the Catholic Church also. what are we likely to see? Given that it's all about numbers, we're going to see 90 priests who were accused of being gay, but will want to deny that they will be gay for one reason or another. We think that you're going to hear a lot of people saying that I am ashamed to be part of this list, I am ashamed that because I'm not truly a homosexual, or even you will hear some things of people saying that I am ashamed because I believe that homosexuality is still a sin. We think that when you do this policy, you open the floodgates for all of these priests who want to deny their actual sexuality, and you create and embed this notion that there might be something wrong with homosexuality, because why are 90 priests denying it when they were on the list? We think that there's a world wherein you reinforce a notion that something is fundamentally wrong with homosexuality. Leomar.
But don't your alternatives all fall into the same conundrum? When the Pope, for example, starts hanging out with gay priests, one of the gay priests also openly deny that they're homosexual.
No, you're wrong, because when you hang out with openly gay priests, people already know that they are gay to begin with, and they're already ready to accept their hearts. The difference in our policy is you won't be forcing people who don't want to go out to say to the world that I am gay, come here and judge me even if I'm not ready. But moreover, we need to consider the impact on the faithful. Let's talk about the faithful who will reject these gay priests, because they were a bit glib when they talked about how it's only tokenistic in liberal context. We would contend that their policy is even more tokenistic in conservative context. Why exactly is that? When your community is not ready to accept the fact that you're gay, you lose all your clout and influence over these faithful. So instead of you having the moral high ground and the moral authority to say homosexuality is a good thing, homosexuality should be accepted, you shouldn't hate yourself for being gay. Instead, these priests are ousted from the community because their community wasn't even ready to begin with to accept the fact that they're homosexual. Conversely, when we only allow people to come forward when they're ready, this is also a factor that priests will weigh in their minds. Is my community ready to accept me for being gay? Do I still have moral authority over this community if I do come out and be gay? We think that these are relevant considerations that are only present if and when they come out when they are ready. We think, ladies and gentlemen, affirmative has been utterly ridiculous in this debate by creating an imposition on these homosexuals who may not be ready for it. It's bad for the church, it's bad for Pope Francis, it's bad for homosexuals. We're winning this debate.
Thanks, the yellow government.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back the frame to a government side. I'm going to show you why it's imperative for you to forcibly out these homosexuals on this first issue. And what tackle it on a principle level is consistent with the Vatican, and how do you undo the wrong that the Vatican has done in the past. Let's tackle the first frame. Because we think that the hiding of homosexuals happens, or homosexuality is being treated badly, happens as an output of Vatican's treatment, especially in conservative countries. So what do I mean by this? When you talk about, let's say, the attitude the Vatican has to most homosexualities, they treat it as a sin, where homosexuals are openly denied their rights, homosexualities are openly ostracized in society. And it's particularly strong in conservative countries where the priests are the image at the forefront of campaigns against them, which means that these countries or these communities are conservative because the church has made them conservative. And conversely, they're against homosexuals because the priests have made them homosexuals. What's the problem here? If the priest in that community is gay, then the priest is a big hypocrite. And we think that as a priest, you're making lives harder for people who share the same plight as you guys. And essentially what you're doing is you're going to make life harder just because you're hiding under the veil of your autonomy and your privacy. We think it's an abuse of privacy to make lives harder for people who are struggling to enter religion, who are struggling to believe in God. Essentially, it's a failure of the state, and that's why we think so. But secondly, why is it strong or proper to force them out? Because we tell you they're really gay or they're anti-gay is because these communities don't see how someone can be religious and homosexual at the same time. The moment someone turns homosexuality, and especially conservative countries, they think, okay, this person is turned away from God, we can't take him in. Despite the fact that in Vatican II, it clearly states that homosexuality is a good thing, or it's not really a good thing, but it's something acceptable, as long as you don't have sex. But the moment you turn gay, the predisposition of people in these conservative societies forced by the priest is that we have to ostracize them and they can't practice religion. And so what happens is you have this idea where people who are homosexual cannot be religious at the same time. And so they cannot fathom the idea you have a religious homosexual. Now, why should we out priests in these settings? Because the moment you can marry the idea of homosexuality and religiousness, it becomes easier, or maybe it's something more realistic and something closer to home for these extremely conservative people to accept homosexuality. Now, here's the thing. These areas are incredibly conservative and incredibly discriminative against homosexuals. It's because of the church. The church has to undo this wrong and help out the homosexuals by forcibly outing the people who has propagated that harm. And we think it's principally conservative. On the next level, I'm talking to you about how sometimes the principles of Vatican isn't exercised properly and it's not consistent with the mandate. We think that the harm done to homosexuality is not something the Vatican wants. But the Vatican has to do it, especially Pope Francis, who's responsible to make sure we practically apply and principally in line with what happens with the Vatican. Essentially that we have to bring back in line. We don't discriminate homosexuals, we have to show that homosexuals can go to church, homosexuals should not be ostracized, and in that way we can do it. And we think that the moment we marry this idea, people will be a bit more open, maybe have some resistance. But the next idea is this. What if the communities aren't as open, or if the communities, really don't have homosexuals and stuff? Sit down, no, thank you. He has an idea saying that, look, you have certain communities who are, far-flung, so it's not really that effective. Maybe 10 gays somewhere out there, but not in my city. Let's tackle the countries that are under the Catholic Church, or strongly under it. Get Spain, Italy, Philippines, US, and Brazil. And all these countries face the dilemma of homosexuals, big homosexual populations who are moving out of this church, which means the probability of having a homosexual within that vicinity is not so far. Or maybe you have, a big homosexual population there. And we think that, sit down, no, thank you. When you make it real and you try to bring back people into that case, you're principally in line with the Vatican, gathering more supporters. Because right now, people who were once turned away by the church can now come back in because now you're trying to bring them in. Please, yes.
Why will gay people want to come back to a church that just outed other gay people and essentially took away their rights and privacy?
If you analyze a lot of Christians, they say, I am Catholic, I believe in God, but I don't believe in the Vatican. It's because the Vatican has become something that you were against, and something that has been hypocritical in their actions. The moment you take this, sure, maybe you have forced them out of their autonomy. We'll discuss autonomy later. But the point is, the Vatican has become more honest when it comes to outing people, and more honest when it comes to its principles, and that's why you will bring back people. But the next issue, or the next sub-issue is this. We tackle autonomy. We think that the moment you enter certain jobs, you have to give it certain rights. For example, if I go to a medical job, I have to give my drug test. I have to tell them what I have in personal life. The same with embassies on what potential blackmail material people have on you. It's the same thing with the church. And we think that the moment the church, as a corporation institution, is making a massive move to change or accept homosexuality, then sometimes we have to overstep some rights. And we think that the reasons why people, have become so antagonistic to homosexuality is because gay priests have abused the veil of secrecy. Gay priests have abused their privacy to the point that they will use their privacy as a tool and weapon against other homosexuals. They will put themselves on a pedestal, which is something hypocritical, which is something we don't agree with. And we think that in these cases, then you can overstep on that particular autonomy. But then, if you're a priest and you really, really don't want to come out, then essentially just quit the job and you quit the clergy and you will have one less hypocritical priest who preach on these things. But you may say, okay, why don't these priests stop preaching homosexuality and stop preaching against homosexuals, talk about other things? We don't think so, because when you're a priest, you're supposed to be able to talk about every single teaching in the Bible and to comment truthfully. On the other side, you will have some priests who just can't talk about some things because they just might be gay, and we don't think it's fair. Sit down, no, thank you. Given that I've shown you how you become more principally in line with the Vatican, and how the Vatican can correct itself in action towards its people, and how it can be a better institution that way. My next issue is this. I'm going to tackle... Okay, fine.
All right, the context of the motion is that we're defining the Catholic acceptance of homosexuality, and you're sending a message that is fundamentally dismissive of legitimate motivations for staying in the closet as inconsequential and not worth considering.
So here's the thing. Some people who are gay, who are not priests, they don't make conscious choices to fight against homosexuals. It means I can take on jobs as a doctor, which my gender does not have to do anything with it. But apparently these homosexuals come in and take the job as a priest, which has a direct effect on the rights, direct effects on lobbying against homosexual rights. And essentially we think it's harmful, which means your job is closely related to being homosexual. We think that if you're going to enter this job, you have to make sure you are clean. The same way other companies, try to enter your private lives, trying to make sure you're clean, or try to make sure you're personal life will not conflict with whatever you're doing. We think the church has equal amount of right to make sure your personal beliefs and your personal predisposition will not conflict against what you're teaching or what you're doing. We think in that way, the church has a right to make sure you're consistent that way, because any amount of inconsistency is an amount of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy is one of the biggest antagonistic things, or what the criticisms against the church. You have to make sure you protect the church from all attacks like this. Imagine that if someone says, look, people have outed gay priests already, but you're still there and you're still in the closet, and you preach against homosexuality. Imagine the PR disaster that the church can state. The church has to make sure they're protected from all possible PR disasters. Next idea is this, on why you will gather more supporters. We think that they have this idea that you will have conservative behavior or conservative people who are going to be lost. We think that equally, you have a lot of liberal people who are taken off or turned off by the church. You have people who are pro-RH, people who are pro-abortion, and all these things. But essentially, right now, they're pissing them off. What you're doing right now is you're going to piss off maybe the conservatives, which you conceded to, but you'll win everyone back, and we think it's fair game that way. But the difference is you'll be more progressive, and people will be happier. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Government Whip Opposition.
Weston's biggest problem in today's debate is that priests in the closets are hypocrites because they preach homosexuality as a sin, and the way that he wants to remove this hypocrisy is to out gay priests. And we don't understand the link to that, because they will still be homosexuals, they will still be preaching against homosexuals under their model. We think the answer is what Nick and Alan told you in this debate, is to change the fundamental message of the church by not saying that we will preach against homosexuals, but to say that we are willing to accept you. So we think that is a really weird argument coming from the government whip, right? There are two questions which will crystallize the win for Ateneo A. First, I want to talk to you about the idea of acceptance for homosexuals in two plans. First, by the church and society, and the acceptance of homosexuals by himself. But second, I want to talk to you about the idea of the followers of the church. First, let's talk about the acceptance by the church and society. Firstly, because they wanted to talk about how the church and the Pope has the right to be able to do this in the first place. We told you, coming from Alan, that that was irrelevant, because whether or not the Pope had the right to be able to out them, we told you it wasn't strategic. They were never responsive on that level. No, thank you. The second thing they told us is that the Pope is very powerful, therefore he needs and can expose the gay network so that everyone will be able to accept homosexuals. However, they never answered the link how when you see a list, you will suddenly go, oh wow, I love homosexuals so much, right? What we told you is that acceptance by the church and society, no thank you, can happen when you say that we're okay with accepting homosexuals. Come to our church. Here are some outed priests that we are supporting right now, right? Their flippant response was, first of all, oh, that's merely lip service. Coming from Nick, we already told you that's precisely what the church does already. But secondly, we elevated this response coming from Lan when we told you that the fact that you tell homosexuals to come into your church and you don't kick them out, and there are other tangible measures to show that it's more than just lip service, is the tangible action that they were begging for the affirmative, coming from the affirmative bench. They never responded to why that wasn't enough. No, thank you. Given that they already conceded that reforms are happening in the church anyway, and this was the bulk of the Prime Minister's case on how reform is present, progress is present, Pope Francis is actually being open towards homosexuals, the question in this debate is, will the affirmatives policy expedite that progress, or will it slow it down? And this was Alan's case, right? Alan told you that forcibly outing individuals who are not ready to come out who have a hard time fighting for their own acceptance to society, to fight the mentality of society, which is what they're depending on in order to accrue their benefits, right? Because they say that in order for society to be able to accept these homosexuals, you out them and you hope that these homosexuals will say, accept me, no thank you. But we characterize from you, coming from Alan, when they don't want to come out, that's not likely to happen. They're going to say, yeah, I'm a homosexual and I regret this choice, especially when they haven't accepted themselves anyway. And that's why the idea of Leomar, of sheer numbers, is something that isn't a good standard. Because there might be 100 priests, but if like 80 or 90 of these priests are not going to say, yes, I'm a homosexual, but I'm ashamed of it, or I'm not going to act on it because I don't want the church to hate me, then the progress that the affirmative bench wants is not going to happen even with the existence of sheer numbers. We don't think Weston really did a good job in resurrecting that case or even responding to the criticisms of Alan. So in terms of being accepted by the church and society, why is our policy better? No, thank you. Because when the priests and the clergy who volunteer to come out, who are ready to challenge the norms, who are willing to say that society, I am gay, but I am also part of the church, so it's perfectly fine for you to be religious and a homosexual, it's when they're open to saying that to society, that's the only time their benefits are going to accrue, when they're willing to speak out, when they're willing to challenge the norms, right? That's also where older cases were dependent on. No, thank you. So the question now is, what is the incentive for these homosexuals to come out if you don't forcibly out them? Coming from their very own characterization, they already told us, first of all, Pope Francis is starting to become more accommodating. So we think there's more leeway for homosexuals to come out anyway. No, thank you. But even the idea of reforms and church being progressive is something that also acts as an incentive for them to come out. But thirdly, the idea of Nick, when we told you that different priests have different situations, maybe some aren't from conservative families, that's also an incentive for some of them to come out. So we don't think it's as impossible as UPD wants, because they like debating on the idea of the extremes, right? So in terms of being able to be accepted by the church and being able to be accepted by society, we have that more. They might not be as much, but we think the people who fight for it are going to be more effective. Leomar.
Can you be the first one to operationalize or counter prop? How do you just stop teaching homosexuality to sin? How do you even get to that discussion?
That's a contradiction with your prime minister, because your prime minister already said that they are more progressive. Pope Francis is already open to homosexuals, right? So the mere fact that even you yourself want them to stop teaching about homosexuality, and you're saying that that homosexuality is bad, and you're saying that there is progress now, that's a contradiction to the entire case of your prime minister. But the second case, and this is where they never responded to us, it's not just about the acceptance of church and society. It's also about the homosexual accepting himself. The most dangerous assumption of UPD is that the ultimate goal of homosexuals is that they need respect from the church and society prima facie. But that's not the case with all homosexuals, right? We were more reasonable coming from our side when we said that homosexuals exist in a spectrum. We told you that there are homosexuals whose primary goal is to be accepted by society and the church. And we told you that those are the homosexuals they only wanted to talk about. And if they do want to come out to the church, we're perfectly fine with that. We can expose them with their consent. We're willing to support them. So we think that end of the spectrum is covered. But there are also homosexuals who value different things. They value that they do not want to be discriminated by their family. They do not want to be discriminated by their mother, their father, their sister. That acceptance is more important to them versus the acceptance of the general public and the acceptance of the church. And these are types of various calculus and that we respect coming from our model. At the end of the day, what you have is you don't just harm gay priests. You harm all homosexuals because you make it the norm to out them even if they aren't ready. The worst case scenario under their model is that society might not accept them as much. But you need to understand that the reason why we want homosexuals to be accepted by society under their model is because we always assume that's what homosexuals want. But given we've proven that they have different interests, we think it's inevitable that you need to be able to listen to them. Lastly, on this idea of followers of the church, Nick told you that Pope Francis has the interest to have more followers of the church, right? We told you under their model, you piss off the liberals who think that the church will be a monster because you out their individuals, you don't respect their autonomy, but even the conservative individuals will be appalled. We don't think they ever responded to that. So if you want to talk about acceptance in two levels and increasing the followers of the church, Ateneo clearly takes this debate.
Thanks, Opposition Whip. Opposition replies to you.
two things. First, what happens on each side and how does each side achieve its intended goals? And secondly, what's best for the church? On the first thing, what happens on each side? From AF, we were given a very hazy image of how exactly they anticipate their step-by-step operationalization to work. Because on one hand, they had a policy of outing gay priests because after all, they don't have autonomy, they don't have privacy, like they made a vow and everything like that. And suddenly, the intended effect is the acceptance of homosexuals. In all honesty, there is a very difficult divide to bridge, and we think that they've provided very little proof that suggests that their policy is able to do that. We provided several attacks to this. First, we asked, why is this policy even necessary? Because as their Prime Minister pointed out, there's already a trend toward acceptance, and you could take less extreme steps in order to show that you are accepting homosexuals. You can canonize somebody who's openly gay, you can promote somebody to Archbishop, you can celebrate Easter Mass, or you can even hold Mass on World Homosexual Day, for instance. There are many things that you can do that would be not just lip service. But secondly, we pointed out to you that their policy clearly sets back the trend with various situations of things that are likely to occur. We brought you the ideas of priests who are likely to deny that they are homosexual even if they're on the list, and we told you that this would be something that's very bad in terms of what it tells believers. Because it's going to tell believers that there must be something so wrong with homosexuality, because why else would these 90 priests be denying it? We also told you that in these conservative communities, it's likely that these people will be rejected from these conservative communities because they don't want to be associated with homosexuals. But finally, we also told you the idea of self-acceptance and how when you force people out of the closet, it's very difficult for them to get accepted for themselves. But our final attack on this was on the concept of autonomy. We already told you early on, and I don't know why Weston still spent 2 minutes on this, the idea that autonomy is a non-issue. Autonomy is a non-issue because this debate is a debate about how the Pope ought to use his power over the autonomy of his priests. So the mere fact that there is a power does not mean that the power ought to be exercised in that way. Conversely, what did we do to you coming from NEG? We told you first you're going to speak to priests, you're going to preach acceptance as they're going to do an AF, but you're going to accept priests who come out of their own choice. Again, you can make them archbishop, celebrate Mass with them. And we already told you this very likely because Pope Francis is already very progressive in the very first place. And it's better because you're only opening it to homosexuals who are ready to accept themselves. We think that this is better because they're better able to fight for their cause and there won't be any self-disgust, there won't be any denial. We don't think we heard any decent or respectable response to that. Let's take a look at the second thing. What's best for the church? First, they were talking about consistency. Then we asked you the question, aren't they being inconsistent by trampling on the one thing, on one of the few things that these homosexuals hold dear? The fact that they can control their identity, the fact that they have a say over who knows what their sexuality is. We don't really think that they've been able to help these homosexuals at all. But we think that it's still possible for the church to be aligned with preaching that homosexuality is acceptable by showing everybody that there are homosexual priests who are still fulfilling their role and their obligation to God. But finally, in terms of believers, and this was the last aspect of the debate which they did very poorly in. They merely conceded from the get-go that you're going to be sacrificing conservatives while never really disputing the fact that you're also going to be sacrificing liberals. Because if I am a God-hating homosexual person and I see that the church is outing homosexuals and taking away their rights, why am I even inclined to belong to that church or go back to that church in the very first place? That was a POI that was poorly answered by Weston. So we argued to you that not only are you losing conservatives, you're also losing liberals, you're also losing non-believers. And when you take that consequence all together, there's something very devastating for the church, and it's no longer going to be an acceptable short-term harm as AF would like to package it. There's a bad idea for the church. We think that it's better to let these homosexuals go out when they're ready because that's the humane thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fly Speaker. Over Fly Speaker.
3 reasons why UPD has to take this debate. Number 1, there was never a clear, cohesive counter-proposal that we heard coming from opposition side. In fact, all we heard was throwing around suggestions, more suggestions with every speaker. Nick just talked about just convincing them, and then when they realized that substantial action is needed, Alan decided to come up with new ideas, like maybe celebrating Christmas with gay priests or appointing gay bishops. We think it's unfair for them to be able to expect us to compare our policy if their policy is one that's been evolving even until opposition reply, right? But even if their policy is this way, we think they're also tiptoeing along their principles. Because if you also appoint a gay bishop, because if you also celebrate Christmas with a gay priest, you're also going to be feeding off the conservatives again as they didn't want to within that particular debate. But what's important for you to consider is operationalization is important within this particular debate. Because what they wanted to do on the second level is just stop teaching homosexuality is a sin. It's really, really that simple in the real world. Never mind the fact that PM already analyzed for you. So what's important for you to bring forth that discussion in the first place is for you to have a starting point. It's for you to have a catalyst for that particular change to essentially happen. We don't think they ever had a clear operationalization to how the discussion's even going to start when you have this kind of policy. But second, we think they crucially abandoned, and they have a crucial lack of response as far as conservative contexts are concerned. We already talked about you a while ago, why under the proposal, only the liberal priests are going to be empowered. And when we talk about those liberal gay priests, they already live in a context where people are already friendly to homosexuals in the first place. But we think as far as homosexuality protection is concerned, and this is what we argued a while ago, it is more important in the context where they are being beaten, where they are being killed. What was the response of Ateneo? They never had a response because they were only willing to talk about the liberal context where they defended. No clear response towards that. But third, they built, coming from opposition whip, the legitimate reasons to stay inside the closet. And again, only opposition whip pointed this out, that you want to stay because of your family, for example, or you want to stay, for example, because you appreciate the value, please stop badgering me, of your family against the greater society. Why does this fail to evolve to the responses that we already laid out? Because the only thing they responded to from my speech was seeing sheer numbers. But that was just one side of the picture. It's not just about seeing 1,000 priests, which again, they just asked a question about. What's the difference of seeing 1,000 priests? They didn't even answer the converse. But more importantly, it's also about seeing people in the most devout, in the most conservative context, right? Seeing them, for example, in Texas is going to be much, much more different again seeing them in Los Angeles. That is the kind of magnitude, that is the kind of impact that you can only get under our side. And again, no response coming from their side. But more importantly, what was their response to our point about personal autonomy? They said that this debate is about what should be and not what the power of the Pope is, right? But again, that is fundamentally misrepresenting the response. Because my response was particularly targeted towards what should be. Because if people, of these priests, have particular concerns about their personal autonomy, like they'd rather be supported by their family rather than by their faith, then that personal autonomy should come secondarily and should come secondarily to what their faith is. Because they're balancing essentially the spiritual welfare of hundreds of people. Because they're balancing the spiritual welfare of thousands of people. And it's important for them to put that at a priority first. It's not just about what is, it's not just about what the power of the Pope is, but what he should do and what these priests should essentially prioritize, right? So essentially we think we've only been responding to the easy responses, but they had to be able to tackle the most difficult ones as well. So to summarize the speech, one, they had to be able to have a clear, cohesive counter-proposal that doesn't violate any of their principles. But second, they had to be able to not build an opposition whip, that's first. But they also had to be able to evolve to the responses that we've already laid out. And thirdly, they had to be able to analyze why, in the conservative context, where it's most important to tackle homosexuality, they still win this debate. For all those reasons, UPD definitely takes it.
Thanks, Governor Speaker, and thanks both teams. You may now cross out leader. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Five minutes. What's your name?
Kim
From?
SMU.
Okay, my name is Jake. I'm from Philippines.
Okay.
Nice to meet you.